Hey everybody, welcome back to the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Christian Bacasa. This week we've got Alan Campbell back. Alan, we're on a few months ago. Gosh, I can't even remember how long ago it was, but you came on, you talked about, microstructure, ambush predators, etc., and really covered quite a bit on that. You're from Grand Rapids, Michigan. You've been tying like crazy. In fact, you are on the Loon professional fly tying team, which is awesome. And I've seen some of your ties are just blowing up, and you can tell that you're a smallmouth and pike focused specialist, and it's coming out in your fly patterns. So it's really cool to see. I'm glad to have you on today. Instead of going back through some of that stuff that we talked about before of like microstructure and living habitat, et cetera, what I really want to do today is talk to you about your personal guide service that you have going on around Grand Rapids and your focus around Smallies and Pike. So we're gonna dive into that a little bit. Then we're gonna step back, and at the end of the show, we're gonna recap. Even if we talk about it a little bit, we're gonna recap what your setups are for both of those species in the boat or on the water, et cetera. So people can go out and go, okay, this is what I kind of want to build out in my quiver of rods and lines, et cetera, to be successful in this area.
Sounds
good. It's really great to have you back on. Before we get started, I just want to plug a couple things for the show. And that is one, we're working really hard on getting lots of content out. We're going to start producing more and more videos and podcasts. So all the shows are on video now. This is really cool. So check us out on YouTube. That's the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast on YouTube. You also know all our social channels, the same thing, at Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. The other big one is I have over 100 articles that I've written now on the Fly Fishing Insider podcast blog. That's FFIPODCAST. So FFIpodcast.com. Go check it out. We got a blog. I recap all of our stories from the shows. I add tips in there. I have, all the standard articles that you would kind of think about. And then I've done some other unique articles as well. So it's really worth checking out. There's been a ton of great response from people. So love to see you guys on there and subscribe, etc. So with that said, Alan, let's jump into the show. I'm going to pass the mic to you. I want to hear kind of how you start out from the Smallie and Pike scenario with your business and what you do there.
Yeah. So, this will be my third full summer or third full year here in Michigan. I got my start down in North Carolina, before I moved back up to Michigan. And, yeah, I mean, you're looking to, how I start out, like the spring or the summer or what?
Yeah, I think, in the spring would be great. I think the big difference that you're seeing, and you and I talked about this, is people come to Michigan and they think trout, right? And they start heading up north to the Pure Marquette, and there's like these two other amazing species that get overlooked, and you're going, no, wait a minute. Like, in actuality, this is really good fishing. You guys should be checking this out. So, how does that come into play? And, what do you do in the spring when people are coming in to go hammer trout up north? You're going, wait, there's stuff here,
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I'll start off by saying I cut my teeth in fly fishing with trout as well, right? And like you mentioned, Michigan is a trout destination spot. That's what everybody thinks of when you think of fly fishing, right? So, I guess I'm trying to maybe evangelize a little bit for smallmouth and for pike, right? They're native fish, right? They're wild fish here in Michigan. I think everybody knows brown trout and rainbow trout are not native to Michigan, although now they are wild. So I try to kind of work some of those angles, right? It has to do with, are you pursuing a wild native fish from in the area? And the other thing is this location, right? I mean, Grand Rapids, Michigan has wonderful smallmouth fishing right in town to an hour, 2 hours away, whereas a lot of trout anglers are going to have to travel an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours to get to the really, really, really good brown trout water, right? Or whatever. So I try to, a little bit it's location, right? The other part of it is like, I think, you catch a 12-inch smallmouth bass, and it's going to be arguably a lot more fun than catching a 12-inch rainbow, right? Or a 12-inch brown or whatever. So
it's a different style. you
It
know, not
is.
only the
And
fishing, but the fights and everything else, right?
exactly. And I think that there's some purists out there that might say like, well, hey, brown trout fishing and trout fishing is more technical, or, they're spookier fish or whatever. I've run into plenty of smallmouth and even largemouth that like you're gonna have to be pretty particular on how to catch them, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
if you want to nymph for smallmouth bass, you want to do that, you can do that. If you want to do top water in the summer, or even early in the mornings, frogging, like you're gonna have those opportunities. And so I think the quality of fight, the location, and the species, it being native. I mean, I think it encompasses a lot of things what like fly fishing anglers are all about. So
Yeah. Let me ask you this. Do you have people that are conventional anglers that come over to fly fishing? Because, I mean, you talk conventional angling. I mean, it's like the Bass Pro Tour, right? If you're
yeah,
not on the tour watching bass fishing, you're not even existing, right? But
yeah,
it's so funny how we go into trout fishing and you say like, oh no, wait, it's they're a little more finicky or it's a little more of an art, etc. And it's like, wait a minute, is it really? Because I mean, some of the best anglers in the world are conventional anglers, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
they'll argue with you all day long. Like some days I go out and I fish all day, and I'm a pro. I can't catch anything, you
hmm
know. So I'm curious to hear, do you have people that transition, or do they maybe have some influence from that market as well?
I think that the best anglers and the best guides, not including myself, take a lot of influence from
Mm-hmm.
conventional tactics. I mean, you look at a streamer per se, right? Like this isn't a fly fishing purist thing, right? It comes from the conventional world, right? And you look at a
Mm-hmm.
lot of crayfish type jigging nymphs and things like that you might tie on a fly rod, and that all comes from somewhere, right? And most of
Right.
the time, it comes from the conventional side. And so, I think when I have clients who do conventional stuff as well, they're probably the best because I think that they understand like, hey, this is how I have to get this particular bait fish or fly or whatever you want to the bottom, or keep it in this
Or
column,
right. Or to
and
move. Right.
yeah, or to move exactly. And they know, again, if you're an angler of any sort, I think the hardest thing to teach somebody is like where the fish are and how to entice them out of it. The mechanics
Mm-hmm.
of fly fishing aren't necessarily easy, but like that's really easy and coachable. Like I can show you how to do that, but I can't necessarily get into your brain and tell you, hey, this is where the fish are, this is how they're looking up, or this is how they're going to move. And so I think conventional anglers should go into fly fishing. They spend a lot of time in the water, and they already kind of know how to do that, right? So it's just kind of taking their mechanics and tweaking it a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I kind of related to, it's funny because I used to be a big skier and
hmm
I skied backcountry and I skied in the resort. And I look at fly fishing as backcountry skiing and conventional skiing as resort skiing. I go,
Sure.
hey man, the backcountry skiing is absolutely amazing. I can hike way up, etc. Get 4 or 5 runs in for the day, and they're absolutely spectacular. But I can go to the resort and I can get 25 runs in and learn a ton in a day and all kinds of different terrain and etc. etc. And that's how I look at it. Is like if you're a conventional angler, you're getting, 3, 4 times as many casts
Oh
as you
yeah.
would as a fly fisher, right? And your ability to just see that many more scenarios, that many more actions of your bait or lure. That's why I think, you go out with a guy who's been conventional fishing and watch them with their rod tip. They'll impart action left and right on their flies.
hmm
Whereas a fly fisherman, it's like you got to teach them, put your rod tip down in the water. You got to jerk your rod. You got to impart action, change your anchor points, all those different things.
Yeah.
It's really kind of unique how that transfer occurs.
And that's a really good point. A conventional angler, when they're jigging the rod or moving the rod tip, they're always picking up that slack, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so as a fly fisherman, as a streamer fisherman, I impart a lot of action with my rod, but I'm always picking up that slack. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the key there is if you jig that rod or you move your tip, you have to pick up that slack because if you don't, you're gonna get to eat, or if you get eaten, you don't feel it. It's off, right?
Yeah, and you have to be on your line side with your hand because if you get an eat and you're jigging like that and you don't put a haul into your set, it's
Yep.
gone. It's just going to bend that
Exactly.
rod tip and there's nothing there.
Yep.
That's a really great point of yours. How people don't pick up slack. I think about that now, and I go, yeah, you see people jig all the time. They hold their rod out with one hand, have their other hand like down by their hip or something. They're jigging the fly along, etc. But yeah, if you're pulling that slack in, you can do it much further away and much more effectively. Very
Well, and
cool.
even think about the Euro guys too, right? Like they throw it out there and they're always kind of moving their slack can a little bit
Yeah.
because they're having that connection, right? And for some reason, like when you're nymphing, you're doing that, but then you go to streamer fishing and then you're moving your rod, but you're not pulling your slack. It's like, I don't know where that disconnect happens, but like you
Yeah.
always want contact with that fly, right? No matter what you're doing. And so I think the angler guys really have a good concept of that. So
yeah, it's funny you say that because I, in the past couple of years, have experimented a lot with Euro style nymphing, but with streamers, whether they're
sure.
smaller streamers or even some larger streamers. The biggest difference I find is they got to be so heavy if they're big, because I got to get them down in a short period
Yeah.
of time. But like you said, you're really jig style fishing, right? I mean, it's
Yep.
what it comes down to, close quarters jig style. So very cool.
Yeah.
Let's talk about springtime. What are the fish doing? What are your kind of setups for the day with your customers? How are you kind of tutoring them into, all right, here's what we're going to do today, and this is why, and then go from there.
Yeah, so springtime, I mean, pretty variable here in Michigan, right? We've had awesome winter streamer fishing up until about today. Now I'm looking at like 3 or 4 inches falling down right now. So, so in the springtime, it'll depend on, if it's raining or snowing or doing both at the same time. A lot of times we'll have some really blown out conditions. But what I'm looking for is I'm looking for basically those really slow seams. I'm mentally remembering where all my rocky spots were throughout the summer and fall, and we're kind of going straight to those locations, right? They are getting ready to spawn if they're not already spawning, right? We don't want to try to target them when they're spawning, obviously, but if you're going to go out beforehand, typically before the spawn, that's kind of my time to scout and recruit and kind of look where I'm going, right? Catch some big fish then. And then I kind of know, all right, I feel dialed in for the spring. Now I'll start taking folks out. And what we're looking for, again, is kind of the deeper sections, rocky sections. We're staying out of the fast water. We're not necessarily in the super shallow stuff quite yet. Water's not really quite warm enough yet. I'm almost always fishing on like the morning sunspot, right? Want that water to hit, or want to hit that sun to hit those rocks, hit that water, warmed up. And a lot of times we're throwing, like we'll throw little bait fish patterns, or we'll do a lot of crawfish sometimes too. I know it's a little bit early for crawfish, but really, you throw anything that's brown or green down there and kind of get it jigging. It could be anything, right? So, that's what I'm doing in terms of setups, fly lines. Typically, it's going to be pretty heavy, and my fly, I don't like weighted flies and heavy lines at the same time. At least not for clients. I try to make it where it's one or the other. It's one or the other. It's rare that I'll have, if it's a conventional angler or if it's somebody who's really experienced, I'll throw a weighted fly out there with a weighted line. But it'll typically be like a mid sink, like a 3.5 sink, or I will never throw like a 7-inch per second sink with a heavy weighted line with a client.
It's just hard to manage as an angler. I mean, it feels real jerky.
Yeah. It's jerky, and then you can't feel that fly well enough. So.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
And I like to, I think I learned it from a couple guys on the White River. I really like to throw, like you said, one or the other. If I'm on a floating line, I'll use weighted flies to get down at times. If I'm on a sink line, I'm using the line for my weight. So I want a weightless fly. I want something that doesn't hold a lot of water. I just want to make it easy to cast and roll over. And that seems to be my big difference for me, at least.
What I like to do is I only use a floating line almost strictly just for top water. Sometimes I'll do like if I'm like more so in the summer, if I'm running like a trough and I want that like 1 or 2 flies to get down there, I might do a floating line if it's like a 2 or 3 foot trough. But in the spring, I will run like an intermediate line, and that's just because I want the line. Like if you're running a floating line and then you run a weighted fly, you kind of have a hinge point there if you
Yep.
don't have somebody who's managing the line very well, right? And you can lose some contact in this little hinge here. With the intermediate line, you're getting a little bit more of kind of a slow sink, and you're hoping that direct line to that fly. So there's a little bit, hopefully more like
Direct
connectivity
connection.
there, direct
Yeah.
connection there. So that's kind of why I'll run like a lightly weighted fly on an intermediate line, just so I can kind of keep everything on the same plane versus the floating line with a heavy sink. Sometimes you get a little bit of a hinge point there that I don't like. So
Yeah. I I I agree with you. And what I see with my floating line is, like you said, if I start to um do more kind of jig style or quick tick stripping,
mm-hmm.
your fly will move more than your line will, it seems like, right? Because you're like,
Yeah,
you strip and then all of a sudden it's like pink hits that fly and that fly shoots and it shoots forward and then that line goes up, like you said, more in that
yeah,
90 or 45, 90-degree angle, and that puts all that slack into that leader. And then you
yeah,
strip again, and it's like half of your strip is actually removing slack, and then boom, ping, it hits the fly again, the fly shoots again.
yeah,
It can put some really cool action on your fly, but it's definitely an area where you lose connectivity. And I
yeah,
see
and
that loss a lot of times in little trout streams where I'm doing that and I'm like, I was fishing, but it's kind of dead. I'm just going to throw some streamers on. I'll throw like a Platte River Spider or something on, and I'll start doing that and like undercuts and whatnot. And I'm like, man, you miss a couple of fish. It's almost like you're wet fly fishing, right? Because you're not.
yeah,
By the time you feel the take, it's like, it's over. I either hooked
yeah,
them or I didn't.
yeah. And we'll do a lot of that in the spring too. Is we'll swing a little bit. I mean, I'm cautious with anchoring up on the raft in too many spots for too long, right? A lot of my floats are a little bit longer, and the name of the game sometimes, especially in the spring, is you got to find where the fish are, right? So you have to cover some water sometimes, and so we'll pull through some sections, nothing's going, that's fine. We'll swing a little bit, and once we start connecting, we'll connect with a lot of fish on the swing. And it's not like we're not throwing like spay patterns or anything like that, but
Yeah,
there'll be a crayfish that we're kind of bouncing down, or a small little bait fish, and then you just kind of let it go. And right about 45 to almost 90 degrees right at the boat, you let that hang there, and you'll catch a lot of smallmouth that way.
yeah,
And it's really
right.
fun because you're like, you see them kind of potted up, or you're at the top of the run, and then at the tail, that's where a lot of them are hanging out, right? And so
Okay.
it's always on the swing that we seem to catch a lot in the spring,
And you're
which makes
probably
it fun.
putting that first mending, casting, mending, so you don't get that big hard swing, but you're getting a nice slow swing, like you said,
Yeah,
hovering out in front of them, and then all of a sudden easing into them, and boom, you're hooking up. Now that's
yeah.
smallies, but what about the pike fishing in the spring?
Pike fishing in the spring, I mean, they're hungry, and if you want to catch pike, you got to go to the really slow, slacky water, right? Um, And in my experience, I found that if you throw in that really kind of pikey, swampy water, you're going to do one of two things. You're going to catch a pike, right? 'Cause that's kind of where they live. Or you might catch, a 20-inch smallmouth bass, right?
Hmm.
And my experience, whether this is right or wrong, I don't know, but I always throw into that water because, or my thought behind that is a 20-inch smallmouth,
Yeah.
that's where they live, right? You're not going to see a lot of other small fish that are going to be habitating in the same spot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do 20-inch smallmouth habitate with pike? I doubt it. I don't know.
Right.
But a lot of
Right.
the pike that we catch too sometimes are 20-inch. They're not huge pike. They might cohabitate a little bit, but you're going to find one or two in those areas. So, a lot of people would be afraid to throw into that section because hey, I don't want to get bit off, or I don't want to catch a pike. I want to catch a big smallmouth. That's like, well, throw in there because you're going to do one of two things. You're either going to catch a pike or you're going to catch that big smallmouth.
Right. Right.
So a lot of times when I'm fishing in the spring, dirty, muddy water, I will run a wire leader almost all the
Mm.
time for
Okay.
that very reason, right? So I'll run like a 20-pound knotable wire,
Mm-hmm.
and I roughly do 12 inches on the high side, maybe 8 inches on the low side, and I'll run like a little fast clip. I don't necessarily like one of these fast clips. I don't
Yep.
necessarily like the other, I forget what they're called. these are quick clips, maybe fast clips or quick links or whatever. Those work well. I like these get a little bit smaller profile. And I'll run, I'll go into that slower water. And if I get a pike, I'm not going to get bit off and I don't have to change. I haven't found that the smallmouth bite gets turned off that often with a wire leader, especially in the spring. Faster, muddier, murkier water, I don't think this can be an issue. In the summertime, when it's low and clear, absolutely not. I will not run a wire leader. But I'm not typically throwing in that froggier water then anyway. So,
how are you tying your leader into your wire? Are you using like a Yucatan knot, or what are you using there?
I use an Albright.
Albright, okay.
Yep, an Albright line, yeah. So,
and then your connectivity to your quick link, what are you using there from your leader? Your wire?
It's like a 2 or 3 turn clinch knot.
That's it. Okay.
Nothing super fancy. Yeah. They look pretty ugly. Not going to lie.
Oh yeah. They always look ugly, right? Wires.
Yeah. The knottable wire never connects well. But one thing that I have learned is like a lot of times when you're cinching on that clinch knot, a lot of times you're pulling like the running end. That'll kink your wire pretty good.
Yes.
What I try to do more is I try to lubricate it a lot and then I pull on the tag end.
Okay. So it cinches in one point onto the running line and all the slack comes out and you just snip it off.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're putting all the kink in the tag line that you're going to eventually,
get rid
clip off. Yeah. And use like your hemos, like, the eye cleaner on your hemos. I'll put that on the quick link or the fast link and pull on that, or sometimes I'll tie them at the vise. So I'll put the link in the vise and just kind of tighten it down that way. But,
I've done the same thing where sometimes I'll just grab a bigger fly. I'll put it on the hook and just.
Yep, exactly.
I have a pair of lid rig nippers.
Oh yeah,
and they have the way the hinge is on the back. You just put it on there and you can kind of crank on it.
Your dubbing loop tool right here is perfect. It's like
exactly
like brass knuckles. You just get the pull right on it.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I think when you saltwater fish a little bit, you learn all those little tricks and how to really crank on that stuff because you're always, like you said, tying a wire or some heavy kind of mono, and you're like, dear Lord, how do I get this tight?
Yeah, the 100-pounder to the 80-pounder, you just wrap around your hand and hopefully you don't pull through your fingers. Right.
Get some welts, some war wounds, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So in spring, that's your kind of MO. You're fishing on pike. You're fishing the feed bag, right? They're hungry.
Yeah.
Heading in.
That's the idea. I think pike typically try to spawn right around like right after ice out, right? Is what I've read. And it's kind of my experience. And so, yeah, like I said, I'll throw right into that slow water, and that's where I catch almost always some of the first few fish of the year when I go scouting are 20-inch bass, and I'm throwing in pike water. So,
and I think our perspective on cohabitation sometimes gets skewed because you think, oh, it's a predator fish, they don't want to be around each other, etc. But I think they learn to cohabitate. I use the example of you go to Capella's in the fish tank. I mean, you see pike and muskie and bass and all the time together. They don't even bother each other, right? Now those guys are probably pellet fed and have other sources, but
they're habituated, yeah.
Right. And in all honesty, I mean, it can't be that bad, right? So I think there are times where they kind of cohabitate, et cetera. And I agree, there's nothing like throwing in the slack water like that and seeing a pike or a muskie or a bass or smallmouth bass, something of size like that predator style where they just appear. It's no different than tossing into a cut bank on a trout and that thing just comes out of nowhere. I mean, those are some of the most exhilarating experiences for me because there's like an internal belief, right? Something's got to be in there. It's that mystery cast, right?
Yeah.
I'm just going to take a chance. And then when it happens, it's like, oh my Lord,
Yeah.
Or when you cast into like a deeper section and out of you see 2 or 3 fish, but out of the dark comes the beast and it just, annihilates you. I mean, that's like amazing for me.
Yeah. When I take out, especially trout guys who are kind of just getting in the smallmouth or the pike area, a lot of times they want to throw in the fast water. They want to throw underneath the log jams on the outside of a bank where it's really fast and deep, right? Like it's in their brain to be like, hey, they're in there. They're in those log jams in the fast water. I mean, you got to think of fish, I mean, we're all like humans, right? We want fast food. We want to go in our cars. We want to drive through the fast food line. We pick up our food and we go home and we eat it, right? I think of it similarly with smallmouth. Like they want to be in the slow water, and the fast water is where their food comes. They pop into the fast food lane, they pop back out, and they're in the slow. They're habitating in the slower, area, depending on water conditions, oxygen, all that other stuff aside, right? They're always going to take the easier route because they need to conserve energy, their metabolism. They don't want, they don't want to be working all the time. That means they have to be eating all the time or put themselves into danger. So I feel like I have to break a lot of those habits of like, hey, we need to cast into the slower stuff. Instead of the outside of the bank, let's cast to the inside of the bank, right? Like there's structure there, and there is enough water moving there that they can pop out and get their food and then go back home and hang out. And so that's a lot of times it's what we're doing, not only in the spring, but all throughout the year, depending on water temperature and oxygenation, right? We're throwing in the slower stuff that people may not think to throw in, and pulling out fish that like, oh my God, that was there. I didn't think about that, right? Instead of an outside of a bend, we're on the inside of the bend,
That's got to be even bigger for pike, I would assume. I mean, pike are like you said, they're drive-through experts, right? They're like, I want my meal and I want to go home and eat it or eat it alone.
Exactly.
They don't want any crowds. They want no disturbance. They don't want to be in the line too long. It's too tiring, whatever. They're just like in and out.
They're trying to Uber that, right? So you got to sometimes drop it right on their house. You got to Uber Fresh or whatever it is. And like, they'll come out and snack on it and hopefully go right back to their little hole. Right. So
they don't even answer the door. They're just like, leave it on the step.
And sometimes that's exactly what happens. I look at it and be like, no, I don't want that.
You got to coax them at the boat. Like, come on, eat the eight.
Yep. Exactly.
That's really cool. That's cool. So spring comes around, and then in the summer, water's heating up. How do your tactics change for that?
So I try to fish earlier in the spring or in the summer, right? My favorite type of fishing is, which I'm sure everybody's, is that topwater bite, right? And so I'll be getting the boat launched and ready before the sun comes up, and hopefully we're on the water. It's light enough out where it's safe and we know what we're fishing, we can see it. But the sun isn't completely up over the trees or up over the bluff or something like that. And that's where it's really fun for frog fishing. And again, that's that slower water right off a seam. And so we try to fish a little bit earlier in the morning, right? And get up to about maybe 10 or 11 or 12. Sun gets really hot. And then we might go into like a streamer game right around then, deeper water, more structure under trees, much like you would trout fishing. The fish are going to get, moving a little bit deeper, shallow or deeper covered water. And then it'll turn back on again, right around 5, 6 o'clock when the sun starts going down. Then we fish typically the other bank and we can go back to top water. But really, it's kind of depends on how you want to catch them. And if you want to catch them on top, you need to go early in the morning to get that frog bite.
When you're fishing from the boat and you're fishing frogs on top, etc., my assumption is you're primarily casting to the bank. But are you casting out in front of you, or are you casting really out into the side and back and kind of using the boat's momentum to your advantage, or are you really slowing the boat down and having people cast out in front and pull back? I'm curious to understand your tactics around that.
So in deeper water, some of our bigger rivers, we'll go right off 90 degrees. I don't like back casting like a 45-degree angle on top water that much, just because it's kind of unusual to have something that is on top swimming kind of like with the current, just my thoughts. So definitely 90 degree. We will do some 45, obviously. I'm not too concerned about like way off the front of the boat until it gets, July, August, super bone skinny. And in which case we're really downsizing. Like, in the springtime, we'll throw, something like this size, right? Like this is a size 2. Or 1 out, 2 out sort of thing.
And that's just summer, like a size 2 popper, deer hair popper.
Yeah, something like that. Yep. And then in the like later on in the summer, we'll downsize it a little bit, right? And then we will go out a little bit farther out in front of the boat. And then sometimes if we want to go top water, it'll be like a boogle bug or like a bombshell popper or something that's super small, and we're not really moving it. I think folks get on the
More
top
skittering
water.
it than popping it kind of thing.
Yeah, you're throwing it out there and letting it plop, and then letting those rings dissipate, and then you're just shaking the line a little bit, right?
Yeah,
Just to
yeah.
get a little bit of action, just a little bit of like flutter
Almost
and
like hopper
wait.
fishing, right? I mean,
It's exactly like hopper fishing is what I would say.
yeah.
Um, and really, I don't like, I tie poppers because there's people who like to fish poppers and there's like people who like to buy poppers, but I don't, if I'm personally fishing myself, I never fish a popper. It's always a diver, because you can still get that action. You can still get that noise, but it
Mm-hmm.
sits a little bit lower in the water. And when you get it to strip, you can actually then get it to swim around log jams and down and
Mm.
underwater a little bit easier. And I
You're,
find that's a little more subtle.
yeah, and you're covering more water from a water column standpoint, in my opinion. When
Yeah,
you get that
exactly.
dive, you're I always think of water as like it's at least three sections, right? There's top
Hmm.
water, then there's like that mid high or that like high level water, and then there's like the low water.
Yep.
And when you have a diver, you're flirting with those two other levels pretty well in
Hmm.
comparison with a top water. I mean, if they're not willing to rise, they're not willing to rise. You know.
Exactly. The places that I see the biggest difference are, that log jam so we'll start, like I always think like the bank and then the log jam creates a little bit of a corner. So I always call it like, hey, hit that corner right there.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll plop, a popper or even a diver in that corner, and we'll let that kind of float and do its thing. And then I'll keep the boat kind of slow, back row a little bit, and I'll let that diver kind of swing in front of that log jam, right? Well, sometimes when that's happening, you can give it a little bit of a strip and it'll dive down, and
Mm.
it'll kind of dive down in front of the log jam, but then kind of
Get
come
into
back
that
up on top
pillow.
of it. Yeah, and
Right,
you're getting
right.
into that little zone where that fish is down there looking up. Now that fish might not want to come up to eat that, right? It's got to expose itself. But if you can get it to dive down in front of its face, then you're going to get tight, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So you'll see a lot of success doing that. Hey, we'll float that down the log and nothing comes on top. Okay, throw it back into that corner. I'll give it a pull underneath every once in a while as it's coming down the log,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll get tight, and you'll be like, I didn't see that happen, but all of a sudden you're tight and that fish is trying to run back into the jam. So
Right. The
that's what you can
hydraulics
get.
change quite a bit there too. Like you said, you have that corner, that water's coming in that top water. And because of that pillow, it's pushing water up. So there's tons of current in that upper level of water. So by having that diver go down, it's actually entering into the slower water where the fish wants to be, from
Exactly.
an energy standpoint. So that's a great point. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And that pillow, that corner usually has some froth, usually has some foam, usually has some debris. And that's where, like, especially when the water's low, that's your one shot to catch that big fish. Because you
Yeah.
got to hit that corner or just upstream of that corner, let it float into that foam. And if you don't get anything, it's a slow pull, get it under the water and wait. And if you don't get it, if you miss that fish on that one spot, then we're rolling to the next one, because that's that fish's
That's that
home.
zone. Yeah. What about
Yeah.
the backside of the log where you get your eddy, et cetera? I mean, really popular with trout fishing, right? Get to the backside of the
Yeah.
log and get in that slow water, get in that slow. You're high sticking of it. Is that another zone that you're kind of aiming for as a backup to that first cast? Like, okay, we didn't pick
Yeah.
anything up there.
Yeah. That's always a spot that we're hitting. You
Now,
know,
do you back? Sorry, I'm going to interrupt real quick while you explain
sure.
that. But do you back row into those areas too, and then kind of like sit in your eddy and put multiple casts into there? How do you utilize that as a guide?
I would say that what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to keep the boat kind of on, like, so the log jam comes off and it creates that like bubble line, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you got that eddy between there and the bank. What I
Mm-hmm.
try to do is I try to keep the boat right kind of on that bubble line. So it's a little bit more work for me. But what
Mm-hmm.
that does is that kind of hides my strokes a little bit, hides the
Mm.
boat a little bit, and then allows that angler to make a couple casts into that spot.
Into that
Kind of
spot. Okay.
yeah, you kind of pie it off, right? So here's your log jam. I stay kind of in the bubble line a little bit. I have them cast up against the backside of the log, and then I have
Mm-hmm.
them cast like 45 or 90 degree off of that, and then a little bit downstream of that, because you don't know what fish is cruising
Yeah.
right
Are they
there,
in the
right?
head of
That's
that or in the tail out of that? Right.
that's a cruising spot, right? They're not really just going to stay there because there's not a whole lot of movement going on as much, right? So they're going to kind of cruise. So you're going to kind of pie it off, and then if nothing comes from there, and I'll bump myself off that seam a little bit back in the kind of the middle of the river, faster river a little bit, and then just have them kind of maybe swing that down, and then look for the next jam, the next spot, right? And that's when we're topwater fishing. I'm not going to neglect those seams if we're streamer fishing, but if we're topwater fishing, I'm not really going to have them fish like the seam right off the bubble line.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, not as often.
This is really interesting, just kind of hearing these different tactics, because it is a little bit different. I want to kind of continue on that. Let's talk about points. So let's say you have an island, right? You have a upwater point that you come across, and then you have the downwater, so the back end of the island and that point. How do you approach those and fish those two zones?
Yeah, so typically where I'm at, the top part of a point, it's almost typically is like a tail out from a run, like upstream of that,
it's like
right?
a shovel, right? Okay.
Yeah, it's like a shoal that kind of comes up, right? And there's a little bit of a shoal, even like a gravel bank that kind of comes off of it. And it depends on how I mean, I don't know if I tackle that so much for top water. If I was doing top water, I guess I would just kind of plop it and kind of let it sit there a little bit. Again, it's shallow water. It's kind of skinny. It asks that fish to come up and expose itself. So I don't want to spook them too much. The backside is, I'm thinking of a couple points in particular that I'm looking at in my mind here. And the backside, again, there's a confluence and there's another long gravel bar, and that's some really shallow water too. Same thing with top water. I'm slapping it down there, and then I'm just kind of letting it kind of sit. Now, if I'm streamer fishing, or especially like with crayfish, I'll swing kind of the front of that island, right? There's usually some buckets right in front of there, and the fish will be kind of on that, on that tail out or just off that gravel bar.
A swing is nice because you can get it out there early and really kind of manipulate it along the swing. Really control it.
You're almost kind of mending it and bouncing it as it's kind of coming down a little bit.
Right. It's very subtle fishing technique. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
And it's almost the tail. Every time I remember, I'm really hitting a tail out really hard. I was out 2 weeks ago with a buddy of mine. We were trout fishing. I'm developing a trout game, section for myself here. And every time we were hitting that deep water and there's nothing there. And then as we're floating by the tail out, boom, 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 there go all the fish.
Yeah,
right. Dang it. Like, I got to remember, hit the tail out. But for the smallmouth, it's really easy to remember just because of all the rocks, right? And so you see the rocks, you're like, okay, great. You're going to swing something through there. I always try to go from shallow to deep. So as we're coming behind that island point, I'll have them throw right to the gravel bank, strip real quick to get off the sand or off the gravel bank, and then let that die. And on that pause or on that drop, that's usually when the fish are kind of sitting there looking up, right? Nothing happens on our side of the point of the gravel bar, then I'll have them throw way over it and pull it over the deep water. And before we hit our side of the gravel bank, let it die. And then once it starts kind of coming up the gravel bank, then it's like, all right, go ahead and get ready for your next cast.
Yeah. That goes back to the conventional fishing. I mean, honestly, go watch, I keep using Bass Pro, the Bass Pro Tour. There's a handful of those tours. I don't pay a ton of attention to them. I watch them every once in a while because they're like free on Netflix or Amazon, Freevee, whatever it is. But they're great to watch because those guys use so much electronics and they can see the bottom of the water or see where the drops are and how effective that is. They're like, oh yeah, here's a drop. We're going to fish this. And then they, like you said, they'll get into a group and they'll just start smashing them, left and right. But really utilizing those contours of the bottom, et cetera, and kind of and I always think of smallmouth bass and bass fishing when I'm fishing with a fly rod as, a lot of times I'm fishing with a streamer, right? Think about bait fish. Where do you see your minnows and things like that? You always see them in those slow, slack waters, etc. But when you walk up to them, what do? They instantly dive in over those drop-offs, right? And I just think of as a trout or bass or whatever, you're sitting on that drop off and you're just waiting. Like, hey, these little guys are going to come over here, and I'm going to be right here for a snack.
Yeah.
And it seems to work that way for me, at least. I'm always on that, like you said, cast to the bank. Maybe I do a count drop with a heavy line, et cetera. And it's like, man, that thing hit on the drop, or it was the first pull off of the drop is where it hit it, et cetera.
Yep. I think also, again, the trout angler gets fixated on the banks or on overhangs, things like that, but middle river structure, mid structure, maybe it's a stump, or maybe it's a couple tangled pieces of timber that got mangled in there. Like, we're always fishing that as well. There's a couple rivers that I fish. There's really nice rocky bottoms, and there's almost like these little rocky. They almost look like the cairns that people put up above.
Oh yeah,
but they're like
points,
under the water,
mid-river
right?
points and stuff.
Yeah, they're these little, like, they're not boulders because it's a series of small rocks put together, but there's a bunch of them throughout the river, and it's always like, hey, it's only 20 feet off the boat, but like throw in front of that and then throw behind that and then go to the next one. And there's always a boulder, spot, and there's always a bucket somewhere around there, right?
Yeah.
So the first thing is aim for that boulder spot and then aim for that bucket behind. And if we're looking for numbers, that's how you're going to get them. And because the small ones, that's where there are, and there's a bunch of them. And so it's just a matter of
next thing you
picking
know,
up,
stacked up.
Yeah, picking up, pull it down, strip, pick it up, pull it down, and you'll be hauling fish out of nowhere. It's seemingly out of nowhere because you can't see them, but it's always the little pieces of structure that you don't think about, especially on a slow day. Start casting the stuff that you wouldn't normally do. And you'll start picking up fish.
Yeah. And that's where it comes in handy too. I think where you mentioned earlier of like, I'm trying to remember where all the rock piles were when the water was low.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So memorizing parts of those substrate and hoping they're still there after melt off and everything else, but understanding the substrate and, like you said, where the hydraulics change and there's buckets for fish to kind of chill in.
Exactly.
So, cool. Let's do this. We're getting ready to run out of time. We got a little bit of time left here. Your website is, what is it? CampbellOutfitter.co.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yep.
CampbellOutfitter.co. So if you want to get a hold of Alan, that's where you go. You're in Grand Rapids. You fish in and around the area. You got a couple areas to go to. Give them a call. Why don't you fire off your phone number so people can get a hold of you there?
Yeah, 616-566-4907. Best way would probably be, through text or even just my email, campbellflyfishing@gmail.com. And then I've recently started using some software off my website that makes it easy for you guys to kind of just schedule if you want. My calendar is usually pretty up to date. What it does is you get to choose the date that you want. There's a couple different listings. You choose it, I get a message, and if there's a conflict, I'll let you know, and we can reschedule it right from there. But it makes the touch points a little bit easier. So
very cool. Now let's do this. I want to dive into, some of the real details of like how you set your rods up for Smallies and Pike. We talked a little bit about some of the leaders, et cetera, but if you could, let's start with Smallies. Just kind of give me a like, hey, here's the types of rods and lines I like to bring. And then here's the leader lengths and setups, et cetera, that I like to use for them. And then we'll do the same for Pike. Yeah.
Keep it pretty simple. When I'm going out, with a client, I'll have a 6-weight. Like if it's topwater season, I'll have a 6-weight ready with like Scientific Anglers, either the bass line, just a straight bass line for warm weather, or I'll use the Titan Pro long or whatever. I really like that. It's a durable line. It's got a nice shooting head on it. Makes turning over flies easy. And I do the 6-weight when I'm throwing like Mr. Wiggly's, big type of dry fly, traditional kind of foam dry fly patterns, hoppers, things like that. If I'm going to go with a deer hair pattern, which is often what I like to do depending on the angler's experience, I'll do an 8-weight. And the reason why I do an 8-weight is just because it makes the fishing experience a little bit more fun. It's a little bit easier. Trying to haul a deer hair fly on a 6-weight, I mean, plenty of people can do it. It just makes it a little bit easier for certain people, right? A lot of my streamer fishing is done on, especially in the summer, is done on an intermediate line. I use the Scientific Anglers intermediate clear tip. And the reason why I like the clear tip is because I'll run, like a 2-foot section, 18-inch section of 15 or 20 pound fluorol on there. And I'll go right from the clear tip line directly to the fly. That's why I like the clear tip. I want my sinking line or my intermediate line to get as close to the fly as possible without necessarily spooking or impeding the action of the fly, right? So 18 inches, 20 inches is usually the sweet spot there. And I do a lot of my fishing with the intermediate because I want that fly or I want that line to get just underneath the surface, but I want it to hover. Like we mentioned, a lot of timber, a lot of rocks. I don't want my fly line to get down too deep too quickly, especially with the inexperienced anglers. It's hard for them to manage that line. Yeah, a lot of folks want to just manage the fly, which is great. But when you start fishing a streamer, you have to start learning how to manage your line as well. So intermediate makes that transition a little bit easier. And of course, you can impart depth with the fly as well. So
so talk about that a little bit, the managing the line, what you mean by that. Because I think if you don't do that or haven't done that, you don't really understand it. Like, what do you mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll try to use the line here if possible. A weighted line is going to sink faster than your fly typically. Depends on the fly you have. But if you're using a buoyant or neutrally buoyant fly, your line is going to go below the fly, right? So managing the line would mean that you need to keep that line at level with your fly or higher. So that means managing the line, I mean by like kind of bouncing the fly line to keep it in the column that you want, right? So an intermediate line makes it easier because it sinks a little bit slower. And as you're pulling it, it kind of stays in the water column. If you have a super heavy sinking line and a buoyant fly, you need to really manage that by keeping it high in the water column. An experienced angler will know that, hey, I need to keep that fly up depending on the water situation. And every time you move this, you're going to move this, right? So managing the line, if you focus on that, keeping the line tight to your fly and over structure, you're going to impart action, right? So I use the intermediate because it's a little bit easier.
What are the tips that you give your clients on how to help them with managing their line? Are they doing shorter strips to do that? Are they lifting their rod tip? What do you like to see from them?
I tell them to bounce the line, right? So in order to do that, you have to, bounce your rod tip. It's not quite a jig. It's more of kind of like a pop. You're kind of popping it up. And as you're doing that, you're stripping a little bit. So there's always like, and I hate using this word like micro strips. I don't like saying I'm micro stripping, but I'm bouncing the line and then I'm pulling a little bit to keep that slack. You're creating slack and then you're managing it by pulling it back down. And what's that doing is bringing my fly up and then I'm keeping it tight.
Okay. So a couple things there. One, like you said, typically your line is pulling your fly down, right? That's why your line gets under your fly from a level standpoint. And then what I really like is how you kind of describe that lifting of the line and then stripping the slack in. And the way I kind of perceive that is like, it's almost like a straight up and down underwater mend, right?
Yeah.
You're lifting the line, and as the line changes in location, you're going, oh, now there's more slack in it. Pull some of that in. Okay, now I have control. And then that puts you back into position. But like you said, your fly is going to be lighter than your line. So the natural intuition of the line is to then add more sag in, start to pull the fly down yet again, and then you have to mend yet again. So it's a very gentle kind of balance in between the two to get to the right levels and et cetera.
Yeah, you're letting the water do the work by kind of letting that going down with the fly, and then you're doing your line is trying to keep that fly in the water column, right? So that's why you use a sinking line. If you use a floating line, every time you move that fly, it's only going up. And then the slack that you leave is what's bringing it down. You miss that connection right through here. With a sinking line, it pulls that fly down and you pop it and then you mend it a little bit and then it sinks down. And then so you're fishing it across the water column versus up the water column. So the intermediate is easiest with inexperienced clients to keep it kind of in the zone a little bit longer, right?
Yeah.
A lot of folks will throw it out there and they got this like they're fumbling around and then that sinking line will get so down so quickly that they'll start stripping and it'll get caught up on stuff.
Yep. It's so funny you say that because that's a big reason why Scientific Angler came out with their graduated lines where they have it's not all the same sink rate. So you get that more direct connection, et cetera.
Exactly. And that's why I like using their lines the best because I know that front end's going to sink at 7 inches per second and that's perfect and that's how I want it.
Yep. Okay, cool. All right, so I interrupted you. We went on a little rabbit hole
No,
there,
that's fine.
but
Yeah,
so
so
go ahead.
that's for my intermediates, right? And a lot of times my intermediates, I'll be fishing like a diver type style fly to kind of counter to help me dig down when I strip, and
Hmm.
then it'll float up. And then when it's springtime or super deep holes, or there's a couple spots that I chase some really big pike in, we're talking 8 to 12 feet. Then I'll use a full sink, like 7 inch per second line. And again, I really typically only fish like an unweighted or a buoyant streamer for that reason. I want that fly to bring it down.
Hmm.
Then I want to manage the depth with my fly line, not with my fly. Um, so I will run. So on my boat, I'll have 2 intermediates. I'll have like 1 or 2 floaters, and then I'll have one like super heavy sink fly line, depending on where we're at. And that
Now,
one is really good too for swinging as well.
okay. So for your pike, are you up leveling your rod? Are you going from an 8 to a 10, or are you sticking more around the 8s, et
Yeah,
cetera?
it's almost all going to be 8s, except for some of that lighter dry fly that we're talking about in the 6. But it's almost all going to be 8s. I think there's a couple sections that I go fish that I will bring a 10 out or an 11 out,
Hmm.
because there's always that possibility, right?
Yeah.
So I like to keep my options open when it comes to big fish. But the 8 weight, and most of the time, really, the 8 weight is.
It's plenty of
I
rod.
don't want to say, yeah, I don't want to say it's overkill for a lot of the smallmouth bass, because you'll get them in the fast water and they'll bend on you. But really, it's more for like the style that you're going to be fishing. If you're fishing a
Hmm.
heavier line or heavier fly, you want that backbone to get that fly out there.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah,
agree. It's less about the power of the fish and controlling the fish, and it's more about being able to deliver a good cast.
exactly.
It's hard. You get a 6 weight and you get a really heavy wet fly on there, or plus a sinking line. I mean, you're bending the heck out of that thing.
Hmm.
And like you said, if it's a clearer day or the water's clear, you need to make some longer casts, and having that little bit more rod just into an 8 weight is a world of a difference when it comes
Yep.
to that. Right? So,
Exactly. And a lot of times you just need it's a one false cast, and then it's a shoot the line out. It's
hmm.
really hard to do that with a 6 weight or a 5 weight, right?
Hmm.
When you're throwing a big fly. And so when I'm doing my top water leaders, I'll do 5 feet or so of maybe some 12 pound. And then maybe I'll do
Hmm.
another couple feet of 10 or 8 pound if it's like really skinny.
Hmm.
But we're talking, and I like the Chameleon Maxima. It does
Hmm.
have this like weird tinged browny red color to it, and it really does disappear really nice. I'm less concerned with like whether it's floor. I mean, I try to go for mono so it floats a little bit more. But if I've got floral, it's really not that big of a deal. These flies are gonna float.
Yeah.
And as long as they disappear in that film, it really doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. Those deer hair flies, there's not much sinking them.
No, and if
Yeah.
anything, you want them to sit kind of in the water. You don't want to see them on
Right.
top. So
Yeah.
a lot of times before I even fish it, I'll get it. I'll tie it on for a client. I'll grab it. I'll get in the water and I'll kind of like squish it a
Smash
little
it.
bit, just
Yeah.
smash it a little
Like a
bit, get it kind
sponge.
of wet. Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, and then it'll kind of sit, butt down a little bit. And I want it to be kind of in there. So, and then when it gets too wet, it gets too floppy, you just tie it out and put a new one on. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And they dry out and they work like new again. That's
Yeah,
what's so
stick them
great
right
about
on
them.
exactly. Stick them on the foam, drive home, and they're ready to go for the next day.
That's
So,
right. That's right.
yeah,
Very cool. Well,
yeah,
Alan, thanks for coming on the show,
appreciate
man.
it.
It's always great to hear from you. We've been staying in touch over the years here and formed a great friendship. I'm so glad to have you on the show and
Thanks for having me.
hear your tricks, and hopefully we get some people to check you out. It's what is it again? I want to get it right. CampbellOutfitting.co. That's CO.
CampbellOutfitters.co.
Sorry, CampbellOutfitters.co.
Yep.
So give him a call if you guys want to check it out, or if you just want to talk fishing. I'm sure Alan will talk your ear off. He's just like me. We love just talking fishing as well. So
Yeah, absolutely.
we'll go from there, guys, and we'll see you next week. Hope you enjoyed the show.